I'll be among the first to admit that most failed card games had good reasons to fail. For every game that found its audience, there are hundreds of games that had bungled marketing, received too little post-release support, or just weren't good enough. There were some games that lasted for a good long while before they failed, like the original Legend of the Five Rings. And even into the 2010s, new games do still pop up on occasion, like Force of Will. The thing is, though, back during the massive boom that the TCG market saw in the 90s and early 2000s, everything had a TCG. And I do mean everything. It got pretty ridiculous at times, to be honest, and I do plan to cover a few of the many, many cash grab licensed TCGs in future episodes. But sometimes, every once in a while, you find an original TCG, not based on any existing property, that deserved a far better fate than it got. Not so much missed potential like with Wyvern, but something that was already pretty great, condemned only by circumstance. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. My name is Craig, and I welcome you to the Dungeon of the Discarded, home of the dead, abandoned, and forgotten games of years past. And this is Ophidian 2350. The history of Ophidian is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. Starting in the late 90s, a group of 5 college students spent half a decade designing and developing the game, one of them even quitting a job at Merrill Lynch to work on it full-time. Pre-release reviews were overwhelmingly positive, the tabletop gaming press was filled with hype, and demos at conventions were smash hits. By all accounts, Ophidian 2350 was primed for success when it hit stores in August of 2003. So what the hell happened? Well, it was published by Fleer. Yes, Fleer Entertainment, one of the biggest manufacturers of sports cards since the 1920s. I think you can see the problem. By 2003, no one was interested in sports cards anymore, and with sales of their flagship products plummeting, Fleer couldn't afford to support Ophidian. In the end, the game was pulled off the market after only 3 months. Fleer themselves would close their doors just 2 years later. I have here copies of every single Ophidian 2350 product. What you're seeing now is all of it. One set of 240 cards with 3 starter decks and a 2-player kit. That's everything. There are so few cards that I had no trouble collecting a complete set. A single Ophidian booster pack contains 11 cards, 7 commons, 3 uncommons, and 1 rare. At least, that's what it says on the box. In practice, I opened a couple packs that contained multiple rares, or even no rares at all in one case, so there was definitely some sort of manufacturing error there. I have never seen anything like it before. There are 3 different starter decks, each containing a 40-card deck, plus an additional 20 random cards. It's like getting an extra-large booster pack as a bonus when you buy your deck, and that's cool. Aside from the fact they don't come with quite enough cards to meet the minimum of 53 for a legal deck, if you don't count the randoms that might not even fit your deck's playstyle, they're pretty nice. They even include some decent cards to start out with. Well, with one exception. One of the 4 gladiators in the Portal and Biotech starter does not belong in this deck at all. Its ability only works on cybernetic minions, of which this deck includes a whopping 2. But that's a minor complaint really, since the whole point of a starter deck is that you'll add to and change it later. There's also this 2-player starter kit, which comes with 2 30-card decks, yes, even smaller than the other already 2 small starters, this 2-player playmat, dice, some counters, and this cool CD-ROM. It supposedly has a tutorial video for the game and music to put on while playing, but I couldn't get any of this to work properly. The joys of outdated software. But enough about that, let's talk about the cards. For starters, the art is really cool. I wouldn't exactly call it polished, but the atmosphere is great. Most of these cards feel like they came straight out of a vintage heavy metal magazine. The flavor text is great too, with lots of the cards referencing characters in other cards, making the world of Ophidian feel cohesive and real. I'm a sucker for well thought out lore in a card game, and Ophidian's got some really cool, albeit often horrifying lore. The card border is also pretty nice. It feels very sci-fi without being so overly detailed as to distract from the important information. If I have one complaint to the card's look, it's that the different colors of the borders can sometimes be really close, making it harder to tell what color they're actually supposed to be at a glance. The other issue lies with the holofoil cards. Now, foil cards are a nice thing to have in any card game. They don't add anything mechanically, but it adds an extra bit of excitement when opening booster packs as you wonder whether any of the cards will have some added bling. Unfortunately, Ophidian has the most pathetic foil cards I have ever seen. Most games will have the foil to the card's art, or the border, or even just the card's name. Ophidian does this. Yeah, this is it. Just a silver border around the art. I have no words. Despite the aforementioned hiccups, aesthetically, Ophidian gets the Dungeon of the Discarded seal of approval. With the exception of one or two cards with relatively boring artwork, it's a nice-looking game with a consistent style that fits its futuristic gladiator arena premise. Now let's talk mechanics. Before anything else, I need to explain the single most unique thing about Ophidian, its showpiece mechanic, if you will. And that's something referred to as the flow. See, in Ophidian, there are no turns. Instead of players taking multiple actions across various turn phases, every card and action in Ophidian has either positive or negative flow. If an action you take has positive flow, you can continue to act afterward. But if it's negative, then the flow passes to your opponent, allowing them to act. So you need to pay close attention to the order in which you do things if you want to actually finish your play before losing the flow to the other player. There is a bit more to it than that, like reactions, which can be used in response to other things, sometimes even if your opponent has the flow. This is a very cool mechanic, at least in theory. It makes the game more fluid and dynamic, and it means you never go too long without being able to do something, which avoids the Yu-Gi-Oh! Problem where you sit twiddling your thumbs while your opponent spends 20 minutes moving through an elaborate combo that you can't interact with. On the other hand, it can be a little difficult to wrap your brain around, and is an early warning sign that maybe Ophidian was a little too complicated for its own good. Don't get me wrong, it's a fantastic game if you're a veteran TCG player, but I can imagine it would have been really unfriendly for new players if it was still on the market. When you dig a little deeper though, Ophidian actually has a lot of similarities to Wyvern. It makes me wonder if some inspiration was taken from that game during the design process, though Ophidian does tend to execute on these ideas better overall. For example, in both games you have 2 decks. In Ophidian, those are a 50-card arsenal with various strategy cards, and a gladiator stack with a minimum of 3 gladiator cards. Let's start by taking a look at the gladiator stack. The gladiator stack is comprised exclusively of gladiator cards. These are similar to dragons from Wyvern, right down to the fact that they start the game already on the board. The biggest difference from that game is that in Ophidian you'll start games with the same 3 or 4 main gladiators in play, rather than drawing randomly from the stack. This is because they range in level from 0 to 4, and the ones you start with begin at level 1. They can level up over the course of a match, becoming stronger and gaining new abilities, but what's really cool is that most of them are double-sided, which means you can get 4 levels from a gladiator with just 2 cards. The level 0 gladiators are all pretty weak, but they exist purely as backup in case one of your main guys is eliminated during a match, and the alternative is just being down a gladiator, so there's no real reason not to use them. What I really love about this system is that it means you'll reliably have the exact gladiators you want in every game, rather than taking a chance on your card draws. This number right here is the most important factor when deciding which gladiators to put in your deck. Gladiators are worth anywhere from 1 to 4 victory points, or VP, and your starting team of level 1 gladiators must be worth exactly 10. The 4 in each starter deck are in a 1, 2, 3, 4 configuration, but you could make a deck with 3, 3, 2, 2, 4, 3, 3, or any other set as long as they add up to 10. Every gladiator also has these health, rage, and damage values. Health should be self-explanatory, it's how many wounds a gladiator can take before being eliminated. Attack damage is also pretty obvious, it's how many wounds that gladiator deals to the target when they attack. Rage is a slightly more complicated mechanic, so I'll get back to it later. And of course, gladiators also have unique special abilities. This red text here tells you how it interacts with the flow, the bold text is the name of the ability, and then you get the ability's actual text. I love card games that gives names to the special skills of their creatures like this. It's just a little extra effort, but it goes a long way to add more flavor to the cards. Flip the card over, and you have the gladiator at the next level, which is basically the same thing, just slightly stronger or with an extra ability added. Most gladiators also have a second card with their level 3 and 4 variants. The Arsenal deck will have a minimum of 50 cards, and contains your strategy cards, which are comprised of everything that isn't a gladiator. Minions, quick hits, pumps, and zones. Minions are like extra mini gladiators that you can summon to the battlefield, so naturally they're laid out similarly to gladiators. The only real difference is that they're only one-sided and they don't have a rage value. Quick hits are instants and sorceries, basically. Cards that come into play, do their thing, and then leave. Simple enough. Pumps are auras or equipment. They attach to a gladiator or minion and affect them in some way, whether that's making them stronger or weaker. Again, simple enough to understand. Where things get needlessly complicated is with the zone cards. Full disclosure, I'm still not sure I understand them completely, and none of the starter decks came with any, so I never got to play with them and figure it out in practice, but I'm going to explain them as best I can. When you play a zone card, it applies to the entire battlefield and everything on it, be it yours or your opponent's, which makes them inherently a bit of a double-edged sword. They remain in play like a minion or pump, but when another zone enters play, all previous zones are flipped, whether that's to turn them face down or turn them face up again. As long as a zone is face down, its effect is ignored, though it will reactivate when another zone hits the board and it flips up again. Between both players, there can only be 4 zone cards in play at one time. If you play a 5th zone, you have to choose one of your previous zones to scrap. This is really the epitome of what I said before about Ophidian being far more complicated than it needs to be. They could have just done something similar to field spells in Yu-Gi-Oh! Here, but instead they had to go for this bizarre flipping thing, making zone cards far more trouble than they're worth. But none of that's what you're here to see. No, you want to know how these cards actually play. The battlefield is divided into 4 fields, 1 action field and 1 support field per player. You can divide your gladiators however you like between the fields. They're somewhat similar to the front and back rows of Wyvern, but a bit more freeform in that neither has any space limitations. You can move gladiators from one to the other, of course, but while advancing from the support field to the action field has a positive flow, retreating back to the support field is negative. Only gladiators in the action field can attack, but those in the support field are more well protected, so there is a purpose to using them both and moving your characters around as needed. When one of your gladiators attacks, you set the attacking gladiator by turning them sideways, exactly like tapping in Magic, and declare which of the opponent's gladiators or minions that you want to target. Then your opponent can either allow the attack to go through, or they can have one of their other unset characters take the hit instead. There are limits to which characters are able to intercept the attack, however. Only unset characters can do so, and only if they're in the same field as the target. Additionally, the intercepting character is set, the same as if they attacked. However, if the target is in the support field, the defending player can instead have a character in the action field protect the target. This is functionally the same as intercepting, except the character doesn't set. Either way, the attacking character deals their attack damage to the defending character, putting that many wounds on them. Sometimes the defending character will be able to deal defense damage, which is now dealt to the attacking character. This is where a gladiator's rage value comes into play. If a gladiator has wounds equal to or higher than their rage value, they're raging, which powers them up a bit. When an unset raging gladiator takes attack damage, they deal 1 rage damage to the attacker, or if a raging gladiator is attacked while set, they unset. Rage also has another effect. Some gladiator abilities have these little face symbols next to them. A purple face means the ability can only be used if the gladiator's raging, and a blue face means it can only be used if they're not raging. So this is something to keep in mind when deciding which of your characters should be taking damage. It's convenient that every starter deck includes 2 of these little cards to track numbers, because there are 2 types of currency to keep track of in Ophidian: cheer and credits. Since Ophidian is built around gladiator battles, you need to keep the crowd happy, and cheer measures how much the crowd likes you. Every time a gladiator attacks, 1 cheer is generated. If the attack goes through to the intended target, or a character protects the target, the attacking player gets the cheer. However, if the attack is intercepted, then the defender gets the cheer. The main purpose of cheer is to allow the players to further manipulate the flow to their advantage. If your opponent takes an action with positive flow, then ordinarily they can act again right away. But if you spend 1 cheer in response to that action, you can shift its flow from positive to negative, forcibly ending your opponent's turn there and letting you act. This is a pretty cool idea. It gives you yet another way to keep the game moving back and forth more quickly, and since you can essentially steal cheer from your opponent by intercepting their attacks, it provides more motivation to set your characters for defensive purposes sometimes, rather than always saving them for attacks. But it's yet another layer of complexity on top of the already really complicated flow system that makes it even harder to learn. Making your game more complicated doesn't necessarily make it more fun to play, guys. On top of this, There are some abilities, denoted by this little thumbs up symbol, that you can only use if you're the crowd favorite, that is, if you have more cheer than your opponent, which is yet another thing you need to constantly keep an eye on. But just directly attacking with gladiators isn't the only thing you're going to be doing in this game. The other currency, credits, is basically the money you spend to play your strategy cards. All strategy cards have these two numbers here, and they tell you how many credits you need to spend in order to use the card. The P represents how much it costs to play the card to start with, in this case 3, and the M is the maintain cost, that is, how much you need to spend in order to keep it in play past a certain point. In yet another similarity to Wyvern, I'm noticing a real pattern here, you start with a fixed quantity of credits, and there are only a few cards that let you earn more. However, unlike Wyvern, there are points at which both players' credits will refill, which makes it more difficult to completely screw yourself over by exhausting your supply too early in the game, something I appreciate. You may have noticed these symbols in the cards up here next to the level numbers. These are the card's disciplines, and this is the main limiting factor in the cards you can use. Functionally, they're similar to the colors in Magic. There are 6 disciplines: War, Cybernetics, Portal, Biotech, Psionic, and Mystic. In order to play a strategy card, you need to check both the card's level and its disciplines. Before you can play the card, you need to have a gladiator or gladiators that meet the requirements listed on the strategy card here. For example, this Thrasher Blade is a level 2 card with 2 cybernetic symbols. This means that, if you want to play it, you need to have at least 2 gladiators with the cybernetics discipline in play, and at least one of them must currently be level 2 or higher. So if I don't have any biotech gladiators in my stack, I probably shouldn't put projectile spines in my deck, since I'll never be able to play it. So wait, if the flow replaces the traditional turn structure and it moves back and forth so often, how do you even structure the game around that? I hear you ask, somehow, despite the fact that this video was pre-recorded before you even asked that question? Well, that's a fantastic question, you perceptive internet person, you, and I will answer that question by now explaining waves. After both players consecutively pass the flow to each other without performing any actions, most likely because they had nothing left they can do, the current wave ends and they enter the breather phase. During the breather, both players may discard as many cards as they want from their hands, then refill their hands by drawing until they have 9, and returning 2 to the bottom of their decks. You don't get to draw any additional cards in the middle of a wave outside of specific card effects, so these 7 cards are likely all you're going to have access to for a while. Then your credits restore. Any that you had left over are lost, and you reset to 10 plus the number of the next wave. So if you're about to enter the 3rd wave of the game, for example, then you get 13 credits. And then you have to decide which of your strategy cards you want to maintain into the coming wave. If they have a skull, they can't be maintained, but otherwise you have to either pay the maintain cost now, or scrap them. You also get to level up one of your gladiators now. Pick one and either flip it over or replace it with its higher level card, and also heal 1 wound from it if it's taken any. Additionally, all of your set cards unset, and you can move your characters around between the action and support fields if you want. And if you've lost any gladiators, you can replace them with level 0 gladiators from your stack. Then you just determine which player starts with the flow in the next wave, the one with the larger total of wounds on their gladiators, and resume playing. So that's the structure of the game. But how do you win? The most obvious method of victory is by knocking out all of your opponent's gladiators, but that's not the only way to win. In fact, there are 2 other victory conditions. Remember victory points? Well, this is why they're called that. When you eliminate one of your opponent's gladiators, you earn that many victory points. At the end of the 4th wave, whichever player has the most victory points wins automatically. If there's a tie, then another wave begins, but otherwise the game ends right there. This is honestly a bit odd, and I don't know how much I like the idea. It does prevent games from running for longer than they need to, but it also means that a player can have a decisive advantage on the board, but still lose just because their opponent got an early victory point lead. This actually happened in the match I played with my friend John. Link to that video is in the description, where both of us were down a single gladiator, and I had weakened his remaining 3 far more than he had mine. If the game had lasted even 1 more wave, I probably would have won, but because the 1 gladiator he had taken out was worth more VP, he won at the end of wave 4. I wouldn't outright call this a bad mechanic, but it does create a lot of salt, so I wouldn't call it good either. The other win condition has to do with cheer. If at any point a player has a total of 15 cheer, they immediately win. Now, the flavor to this win condition is quite fitting, with the idea being that the crowd riots and tears the opposing team apart. So it's good that it's there, but I can't imagine it happening very often, if ever. 15 cheer is a lot to accumulate, and it's just too useful as a resource to seize control of the flow to use it for anything else. Most likely you're going to be spending your cheer almost as quickly as you earn it, and the game will end via other means before you ever reach 15. There is one other issue that I'd like to talk about, and it's yet another thing that Ophidian has in common with Wyvern: the frequency of useless card effects. There are a few cards here that are so situational or redundant, I can't imagine ever willingly putting them into a deck. A perfect example is Adapter Droid, which can actually be found in a couple of the starter decks. It's a minion that deals 0 attack damage, making it useless in a fight, and its ability lets you deal 1 wound to it in order to look at the top 2 cards of either player's deck and put them back in any order. I honestly can't think of any time when this would be worth using. I already know what's in my own deck, and as for using it to see my opponents, looking at your opponent's cards is an effect that a lot of TCG designers, especially when they're just starting out, assume is really powerful, but honestly isn't. It's information, sure, but it's rarely information that will actually impact the game in any meaningful way. Most likely, you're both going to make the same moves regardless of whether or not you know what the other guy has. Oh, but it lets you reorder the top cards of a deck. That could be useful. Ordinarily, yes, but not in this game. In a game where you draw 1 card per turn, yes, manipulating the top card of your deck can have a sizable impact. But in Ophidian, you're going to draw up to 9 cards as soon as the current wave is over. So switching the order of the top 2 cards of my deck doesn't change anything whatsoever, because odds are I'm going to draw them both at the same time anyway. The only situation in which I can see Adapter Droid being a useful card is if you play something like Adrenaline Shot to draw a single card in the middle of a wave. But even then, it's a ton of additional effort for very little payoff, so even then Adapter Droid has basically no value. The same principle applies to a lot of the Gladiator cards. Their abilities tend to be pretty underwhelming, all things considered. Many of them have abilities that require you to set them, which is a huge cost, since unless a Gladiator's raging, there's very rarely any way to unset them before the end of a wave, and odds are you're only going to be able to play 4 waves before the game's over. Under most circumstances, just having them attack or intercept is a better option than using their abilities. By setting Opak Sentire, I can either force my opponent to discard 1 card that I don't even get to choose, or I can just attack for 2 damage. I know which option I'd pick. The designers probably assumed that since the players would always have access to their gladiators, they had to keep them from being too powerful. But I think that's a bit misguided when the player has so few of them to begin with. Heck, Magic the Gathering has the Commander format, in which you have constant access to 1 specific creature, and that's arguably the most fun format of the game. But at the end of the day, even with the flaws I've mentioned, Ophidian 2350 is really dang good. It's far more complicated and difficult to learn than it really needed to be, and there are some major balance issues, but the flavor is great, the mechanics are unique, and it's just so much fun to play. I really like this game. I'm terrible at it, I'll readily admit that, but I still have a great time playing it. It really is a tragedy what happened to this game. If only someone could bring it back, a new version with more cards and updated rules that people might actually play. Oh wait. Yes, the saga of Ophidian 2350, shockingly enough, actually has a happy ending. In 2015, a small company called Hack and Slash Games acquired the rights to Ophidian, and following a successful Kickstarter, 2016 saw the release of Ophidian 2360, an LCG version of the game with revised rules and new and updated cards. It's even backwards compatible with the original cards. This version actually addresses some of my complaints with the original. There are no zone cards, at least not yet, so that overly complicated nonsense is gone, and gladiator abilities are a little bit stronger. The easiest way to demonstrate this would be to compare both versions of one of the gladiators who's already been reprinted, the Prince of Gates, whose name I will not even try to pronounce. In 2350, you could give him 1 wound to add any portal minion from your deck to your hand at the very start of a wave. This was already one of the more useful gladiator abilities to begin with, but in 2360, now he no longer needs to take a wound in order to use this ability. It just activates automatically. And they even gave him 1 more health. That's nice. The differences get even bigger as he gains levels, too. Overall, the new version of this gladiator is a significant step up from the original card. and as far as I can tell, this seems to be the case across the board. If I have one point of criticism, it's with the artwork. Some of the reprints still have their original art, but many of them have new art, and all of the new cards by necessity have new art. And the new art is great. In fact, it's a little too good. In making the frames this slick and the artwork this polished, the game loses a lot of the charm of the original version. But that one nitpick is small potatoes, honestly. I haven't had a chance to play very much of this version, and I only have one of the 3 packs, but as good as Ophidian was the first time around, this new one is even better. So, props to you, Hack and Slash Games. You did good. Until the next time you pay me a visit, this is Craig bidding you farewell from the Dungeon of the Discarded.